What's going on, everyone? My name is Ben. If you don't know who I am, I make educational lifting videos. And today I wanted to address this question of, do hamstrings contribute to squats and leg presses and split squats? Because I polled my audience the other day on Instagram. 15,000 people answered the question, do hamstrings get trained in a leg press? And 9,000 people said yes. And that is wrong. So today I'm going to clarify that for you, and I hope that it freaking makes sense. Okay, so when we think about the hamstrings, what do you all think of? Just conjure up an image, okay? Most people will probably say something like a leg curl, right? Like a knee bending exercise, because that's what the hamstrings do. They bend the knee. Why do they bend the knee? Well, specifically because they attach all the way from this hip and they attach down to the back of the shin. And when we're thinking about their action on the shin, they just pull the shin in this direction, right? Which is a knee bending thing. So the simplest explanation, and I'll move from simple to more complicated here, as to why the hamstrings don't contribute to a squat, is just simply the fact that the hamstrings are essentially trying to pull this bone to this bone. In other words, they're trying to bend the knee. They're trying to close that gap. And in a squat, we are trying to do the opposite. We are trying to straighten the knee. So when we think about why hamstrings don't contribute to a squat, the first and most simple and concrete explanation is that we need to recruit our quads to straighten the knee, and any little itty bitty ounce of contraction we create over here to bend the knee will directly act against the quad's ability to essentially pull in this direction to straighten the knee, okay? Now the question becomes, well, Ben, don't the hamstrings contribute to hip extension? And isn't hip extension something we're training in a squat? Why, yes. What a fantastic point. For those of you who don't know, this is hip extension. So hip extension is this sort of counterclockwise representation here, pulling the leg backward. And hip extension occurs in a squat because when we're in this position, the hip, right, the hip joint is right here, but this whole leg bone, the femur, needs to be pulled in this direction, right? And that's what we're resisting against, which is basically the floor pushing upward on us this way. And when the floor pushes upward on us this way, it's essentially pushing our knee to our chest, and so we have to perform the opposite, okay? So hip extensors, like the hamstrings, because the hamstrings do contribute to hip extension, need to act. This is why, for instance, a squat recruits the glute max and that big muscle on the inner thigh, because it challenges hip extension, much like a leg press, much like a split squat do as well. So when we're thinking about, the hamstrings contribute to hip extension and knee flexion, we need to think more specifically about the fact that when muscles contract, they do not pick and choose which joint actions they're going to create. So let me just show you a different example here on another person, which is that when the hamstrings contract, okay, they are not going to choose. They're not going to like sit there and be like, I'm going to decide to bend the knee this way, or I'm going to decide to try to hip extend the femur this way. They are going to do both of those things simultaneously. And because they always do both of those things simultaneously, they're always going to interfere with the action of straightening the knee. Because the hamstrings are never going to pick and choose their joint action, they're never going to be able to not attempt to bend the knee, right? The same is true, for example, in a leg press with muscles like the rectus femoris, which run all the way on the front side of the knee to the hip. The rectus femoris is a hip flexor, meaning it actually pulls the femur in this direction. So if we're trying to pull the femur in this direction, the rectus femoris, even though, yes, it crosses the front side of the knee and it straightens the knee, it can't contribute substantially to the motion, because for every little itty bitty ounce of knee straightening action that it creates, it will also try to be pulling the femur this way. So the same is true for the hamstrings. For every little itty bitty ounce of hip extension for femur pushing forward the hamstrings can create, it will also simultaneously apply that force, that torque, to the knee in bending. And the reason, by the way, that all of this is happening in the first place is because if you look at any of these types of motions, we'll pick a split squat example now because these are all principally the same, what you will notice is that all of the forces in these exercises are the same. So just pretend that line is totally straight, okay? That is the resistance that we are acting against in all of these motions. It's basically a line that goes through the shin and through the femur. And what that means is that it applies a torque to the knee at this distance and a torque to the hip at this distance. And it essentially will try to bend the knee because it is on this side of the knee, and it will try to bend the hip because it is on this side of the hip. So put more simply, because of the line of force of these exercises, all of these exercises are exercises that try to bend our knees, against which our quads need to act, and bend our hips, against which our hip extensors or glutes, our adductors need to act. And because those two things are occurring together, because our quads need to act, because our knee is getting bent, every little itty bitty ounce, I keep saying that phrase, why do I keep saying it, of contraction that our quads create, right, that needs to go into us moving the load. And every bit of contraction that the hamstrings create against that direction is an amount of contraction that will prevent us from accomplishing that task. And so yes, even though the hamstrings attach to the hip and pull the hip into hip extension, they are not hip extension muscles all the time. And there's a very important lesson to extract from this, because there are many other instances, for example, like with the rectus femoris that we talked about, where there will be a two joint muscle that has one opposing joint action and one joint action that contributes. So for example, if I'm doing a pull down exercise, people will talk about how that's a biceps exercise, but my biceps are shoulder flexors to a small degree. And so if I'm actually creating a pulling motion, yeah, I'm bending my elbow, but I'm also moving my shoulder in the opposite directions that my biceps would want to move my shoulder. Now that's not as good or powerful as an example of, or as compared to the ones that we just went over, because the biceps aren't great at moving the shoulder, but hopefully that comparison makes sense, because again, all that we're really seeing across all these scenarios are situations where two joint muscles have one joint action which contributes, one joint action that opposes the motion. And if that is the case, because muscles can't actually pick and choose which joint action they're going to create, they're always going to create both, because that's how muscles contract, that's how muscles work. They just pull to their center points. We need to make that consideration when we're doing leg presses, specifically as it relates to the hamstrings. So when we're training the hamstrings, we want to stick to things like stiff-legged deadlifts, stiff-legged hinges, where the knee isn't moving, and leg curls. Those are the two motions that I would advise for training the hamstrings for those reasons. And if you feel like you have some sensation in your hamstrings in these types of motions, more than likely it's that big inner thigh muscle called the adductor magnus, and not actually the hamstrings. So I hope this helps. Please ask your questions below if I can clarify anything, or if I wasn't making any sense at all. And I'll see you all in the next video.